Good evening, good people from Eastbourne. You can tell that I'm not from these parts, obviously, but I have lived in Brighton for 38 years. So I think that qualifies me as a sort of Sussex man, really, my service alone. When I heard that, I just tell you a little story. I was in Glasgow yesterday, and you're talking about dating apps. I'm not on a dating app, but I was giving this keynote at a conference, and one of the people in the audience, you know ChatGTP, which is the AI app, which has gone crazy in the world. Well, this guy taught in a really rough college in my hometown, actually, and there were these young kids, 16-year-olds, some of them had been in prison, boys who had been, like seriously troubled kids. And he showed them this thing, and he said, you got any idea what you might use this for? And one of the kids said, and pardon my language, he said, well, my Tinder apps are absolutely shite, my profile on Tinder's terrible. So he got his Tinder profile up, a little bit of text that goes with your picture, and he used the app, and he went from 90 hits on day one. So there's a free tip for you if you're on the dating app. Get your AI app out and get your profile rewritten. Now my job this evening is to make one of the most boring topics on the planet interesting, chalk. But it is the stuff, you're not actually sitting on chalk, it's just a wee bit at the cliff end there where it stops. But this was originally written for people of Brighton, but nevertheless, I am a sort of rock guy, not in a AC/DC sense, but in terms of all my adult life, I've been looking down, collecting fossils and rocks. It started, I grew up in mining villages in Scotland, and the miners there often had fossils, which they brought up from the pit, and that's what got me started. So I'm getting on a bit, so I've collected, my house is full of this stuff now, these ammonites. And you hardly ever think about this stuff beneath your feet. We're all sitting on this tiny little crust on the earth, sitting on this huge massive liquid, fiery liquid. It's only 1% of the mass of the earth, the crust. 1%, it's like a tiny eggshell. And as you're sitting here now, you're spinning, orbiting, well actually you're spinning, the earth is just spinning, so you're actually moving at about 1,000 miles an hour, just on the spinning of the earth. That's 1,000 miles an hour. But you're also orbiting the sun. How fast do you think that goes? Because you're then actually moving at 65,000 miles an hour. As you sit here, you're spinning through space at 65,000 miles an hour. But that's not the end of it, because we're in a galaxy, the Milky Way. As you're spinning round the galaxy, add 500,000 miles per hour. 500,000 miles an hour. That's actually happening to you right now. Eh? Wikipedia. I spent a life thing. This is not my profession, it's just a hobby, as it were. You get to know all sorts of weird stuff on the back of this. But the physics is exact, you don't feel it. That's an interesting fact that you don't. So lots of these things, ammonites, you'll know the name for that. Ammonites are interesting because before Darwin, the very early days, this puzzled people, when we thought that the universe was God created. What on earth were these tiny things? And they called them snake stones, because they thought they had been coiled up snakes that had been turned into stone. And in fact, some of them you can still, this one's a jet, they carved the snake head on just to confirm that. Of course, it was completely and utterly wrong. But the name Ammonite comes from the god Amun-Ra. And if you've ever been to Luxor in Egypt, I was there in December, and stood right where this guy was, here, right here. His temple at Karnak is absolutely astounding. I've been there, 134 pillars in Karnak. But Ammon is the horn on the ram, as you see here, the god Amun-Ra, worshipping the sun. That's where the name for Ammonites comes from. But I'm going to take you on a little journey now across the Downs and across Sussex, and you can go and visit these places, but I wonder how many of them you've actually been to. So, has anybody seen the giant ammonites of Peacehaven? Not a single person. Great, okay, well here's your first one. If you head along Peacehaven and go down that little slope, if you've been to the Undercliff, go 4 groins along, go onto the beach, and you'll find these ammonites. Now these ammonites were huge, absolutely enormous. I'm 6'4", they were just a little bit shorter than me, and they would float through the ocean, just about 85, 90 million years ago, when this land you're sitting on was actually down near the equator. It's a sort of tropical warm sea. So the chalk is just the sediments from that sea. And it's very white because there were no land pollutants, no mud came into it, pure white. These things are about a metre, sometimes much bigger across, but they were as big as small smart cars, these things. They were huge squid-like creatures floating because their chambers were full of gas. And you can see the shapes in some of these things I'm going to show you shortly. That's my dog. That's Doug. In Scotland, everybody calls the dog a Doug, so we called him Doug. Only people in Scotland get the joke, really. He's a schnauzer, but you can see, he's a fairly big schnauzer. You can see the size of this ammonite behind his feet. If you go down to the beach, there are dozens of these things. And once you notice one, you start to see them all. So keep your eye out. If you go in, you probably won't see them at first, then you start to see them everywhere. And the key trademark is that little hole in the middle. Remember, they're spirals. Okay? This one you can see the cliff in the back and the concrete here. A side view of the thing. And these marks here are marks between the chambers. These are the flotation chambers that allowed the ammonites to float and catch their prey. They were a bit like squids, modern day squids. And you can see this is the cast of one, which is quite nicely captured by the algae or seaweed sitting on the cast itself. And once you see them, see the round shape here? These are really big. There's another beautiful one there. One in the chalk. Sometimes you go back up onto the beach, you'll see the shape, and once you get the little hole in the middle idea in the circle, you'll spot them again. Another one, the hole in the middle. There's Doug again. This time that's not an ammonite, but if you look carefully, huge amount of flint in the chalk here. And these are actually lobster burrows. So flint, which comes from the spines of sea sponges, going back 85, 90 million years ago, which are turned into solution, and they leach through the chalk, and they eventually agglomerate around either a fossil, or sometimes you get beds of flint, which you'll see in the cliffs along Eastbourne. And in this case, it actually leaches into the burrows of the lobsters and forms that sort of shape. So sometimes you get pipe flint, which goes into the burrows of other creatures. And this is another one of those lobster burrows there. Anybody any idea what this is? In the chalk, round pebbles. No? It's a real puzzle, and it puzzled geologists for a long time as well. It turns out that there were creatures floating in that ocean, that warm ocean where the chalk sediment settled, and those creatures had stomachs and they ate, and this is a bit like the stuff that's in the gizzards of cows and other mammals. In other words, they had that in their stomach to digest their food. And of course, when the animal died and dropped to the bottom of the ocean, everything would disappear apart from the stones in their stomach. It took ages to figure out why these round pebbles, because rounded pebbles are normally a sign of erosion within a river or tumbling of something. Of course, that can't happen in the middle of an ocean. But these are gizzard stones. And if the ammonites are down here in Peacehaven, I don't know if you've been up this structure. I remember when I first came across this. This is at Peacehaven. It's absolutely enormous. And if you walk up here, you're going through the sections of about, 10 million years or so. You can crawl up that and really examine the flints and the beds in a lot of detail. Okay, nobody had been to Peacehaven. My second question is, have you been to the mystery holes of Hope Gap? You have to get out more, folks. Okay, the mystery holes of Hope Gap. We all know, I think this is one of the most beautiful scenes. England's a beautiful country, but this is a really amazing scene from Hope Gap. You'll all have been there, I'm sure. It's iconic almost. You see it in television and movies all the time. But if you go down to the beach there at Hope Gap, turn left, you see these. And again, these were a bit of a puzzle. They're about 1 metre across, holes sitting there, uplifted off the rest of the rock. Anybody have an idea what these are? Sorry? They are holes. You don't get a cigar yet. No?
I don't know if it's the same, but at Burling Gap there was Bronze Age shaft through,
Right.
through the cliffs.
We'll come to that in a minute.
Is that
This is not that, but good guess.
something similar?
It's actually a completely natural phenomenon. But you're sort of being prophetic here, you'll see in a minute. These holes were formed as follows. Let me explain. There's Doug's head again. You can see how big this thing, sometimes they hold pools of water when the tide goes out. Perfectly circular, about 1 metre, lots of them. Okay? And I'll tell you how they formed. So along there, you may notice that unlike most of the cliffs right along the south coast, there's this huge brown area of silt sitting above the chalk. And this is sort of dust and debris from the Ice Age. It's called Lewis in German. And it's slightly acidic. So when the rain falls, it leaches through the acidic dust, hits the chalk layer, and then it starts to eat into the chalk, a bit like vinegar into calcium carbonate. And it pools and forms circles, and it eats down, and remember you're talking millions of years here. Over millions of years, this stuff leaches down until it forms a pipe through the chalk. So there's a complete circular column, empty column, through the chalk, and when the sea comes in and wipes it away, you're just left at the bottom. You can see some of these in formation here. You see the brown streaks down here? So these are solution pipes in formation. And all you're left with, when the chalk is eroded away by the waves, is the bottom of the pipe. It's a sort of fascinating, weird and puzzling thing when you come across it. Okay. And that is a real place, Cocking, by the way. And if you go to Cocking and you walk south from Cocking, you will come across the giant balls of Cocking. And anybody know what the giant balls of Cocking are? Nope. Okay, here's another walk for you then. That is one of the giant balls of Cocking, and it is huge. And it's made of chalk. Anybody any idea what this, how that got there? No? Okay, well, there's an artist, quite a famous artist, called Andy Goldsworthy. He's a landscape artist, famous around the world, in fact, especially in the US. And he did something quite interesting. He quarried 14 of these huge, these are about, I think about 8, 9, 10 foot in diameter. And he sat them in a row on a long walk. It's quite a long walk actually, about 10 miles. And when you come across them, they're sort of stunningly weird in the landscape, because obviously chalk never forms this sort of geological feature, such a round figure as it were. But what he was reflecting was the geology of chalk. Because if you look under a microscope, a lot of the chalk is made up of tiny little spherical skeletons of the things that landed at the bottom of the ocean after they died. So it reflected the geology, but more than that, he wanted to show that these things would erode very quickly. Chalk doesn't, there's no surface water on the downs because chalk is porous. So you don't get rivers up the top, or springs, all the springs are at the bottom. And it's a very soft rock, so it erodes quickly. So this was the second one on the path, which you can see is already broken up. It's a really interesting artwork in a way, reflecting the geology, a bit strange in the landscape, but eroding away to nothing, just as all rock does. It's a really brilliant walk, by the way. So find Cocking, head south, beautiful walk. Now, this is where your prophecy came a bit true here. During COVID, there was a huge slip at Seaford. You probably heard the rumble of those now and again. And when that happened, I have one of those drones. Myself and my son went down, and we took the drone off the top of the cliff. And on the left-hand side here, this is an Iron Age camp, okay? And on the left-hand side here, you can see the ditch that surrounded the camp. You can see how all the spill has been deliberately put up on the edge here. And then these things here, we'll see them clear here, and along here, and possibly this one as well, may well be, because these are common in Iron Age camps, places where they stored their grain. Because the winters were harsh. How did you get through the winter? Well, you would fill those things with grain and cap them off, and you'll notice how this is capped. Same with this one, a little bit of chalk at the top. And surrounding the grain, some of it would rot, but as it rotted, the bacteria would eat up the oxygen, so there was no oxygen left, so that the rest of the grain would remain intact and eatable when spring came. This is very common in Iron Age camps. So we flew the drone off the side here. Again, you can see the ditch of the Iron Age camp there, and got these beautiful shots. It's probably all browned off now. But if you get down there, some amazing things. And just behind this is that. Anybody any idea what that is?
VOR beacon.
Very well done. Yeah, so these are slightly redundant now, but they're still there as a sort of backup system for all the aircraft that were coming into the UK. Are you professionally associated with that?
No.
No?
But I was married to an air traffic controller.
All right, you've got you. Well done. You do get a cigar then. It's an amazing, it was like a piece of modern sculpture almost. And this is a place I really love. It's not far from my house, and it's Stanmore Park, just outside Brighton, which you may, if you've got a dog, you've probably been there several times. Like me, there's my dog. It's Doug again. My friend John Helmer says this is the most Scottish-looking dog he's ever seen in his life. Probably right there. My Schnauzer, and I love him. So, if you're going to all sorts of weird things I could tell you about in terms of a walk around Stanmore Park, because it has almost every age. We have Bronze Age barrows here. So that's, going back to, from 2500 BC onwards, dug in the middle of a barrow. You can see how big this thing, huge bull barrow. And then in the middle of Stanmore here, they used to have big guns in this place, and you can still see the 20mm bottoms of the shells that were shot at German aircraft as they came in over the south coast there. You can see this littering all over the place. Once you know what you're looking for, you can see amazing things in these parks. And right next to the gun emplacement was this, and I didn't know what it was, but you can see this little hole in the side. I shut my phone in, switched the light on, and I couldn't see the bottom. So remember, this is chalk, no surface water, so to get the water you have to dig, and you have to dig deep. You don't hit the water table until you're over 200 feet. And this thing is capped off because it's so dangerous, obviously. And that's the top, looks obviously at the winding. This is a 19th century winding mechanism that's put in there. And then, of course, we have the Iron Age and Romans as a sort of Britannic Roman settlement just up at, just behind the woods. And that's now closed over there, but they have found Roman pottery and coins in that site as well. So almost everybody ended up living on the Downs at one point or another. Another thing near there in Stanmore Park, which hardly anybody has seen. It always amazes me, because England's just full of such great stuff that it doesn't surprise me that some of the things are missed. But going back to that proposition that there's no surface water, how did Stanmore House get its water? That was a huge Palladian mansion built in the early 18th century. And it was before they dug the well. Actually, slightly afterwards. As I say, on top of the Downs, remember the only water you ever see are these dew ponds. I took this with quite a long lens, and as I was taking a picture, because I really love this image, this girl came out and did this in her Wellingtons. I thought, that's the most Brighton thing I've ever seen, Who does that out on the walk in her Wellingtons? It was a complete sort of accident. I was really far away. She was completely unaware of the fact that I was there. But that surface water is sometimes beautiful, but that's only because there's clay beneath it, deliberately placed there so the animals on top of the Downs can drink water. But this is a runoff, and there's only one of them in the whole of the UK, and it's in Stanmore Woods. And this is the size of a football pitch, and you can see it's a bit of an angle here because it was laid down in concrete. It used to have big structures with roofs, slate roofs, so the rainwater would run off the roof, go into the runoff, go into the channel at the bottom. They had a sort of carbon filter at the end, filter of water, and there are two huge underground Victorian bottle-shaped caverns that held the water made of brick. And that's in the middle of the woods. Nobody ever goes near it. 1874, but an amazing structure in itself, intimately linked to the fact that we're living on chalk. And then not far from Stanmore House itself, which you probably know, is this. So this little building here, the church in Stanmore was actually demolished, the old church, and a new one built in the 19th century, but they took some of the stones and built this little hut here. And inside, do you know what's in there? It's a donkey mill. It's called a donkey mill, and it's 252 feet deep. That's a long way. And that's the bottom of the well here. And this was the mechanism. And strangely enough, it wasn't a donkey that stood in that. For 30 years, they hired men to tread that treadmill like hamsters. For 30 years, people stood in that thing to get the water, turning it round and round. And sometimes it's open on open days. But it's a huge, deep well. There's another one just along behind the house as well. This is a horse engine, and the well is here, but they used a horse rather than human beings to draw the water. Okay, further along on the Downs and the chalk, There's a very good reason that these people here. The earliest human bone that we've found in the UK was a leg bone at Boxgrove. And this is another species. This is Homo heidelbergus. And at Boxgrove, a group of hunter-gatherers, 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, found a horse, killed it, and butchered it on the spot. Not only did they butcher on the spot, they created their own tools on that very spot. And places littered with tools. This is one of the most fascinating, however, because this is a U shape. And it's a U shape because the person who made the tool, the flint tool, lay down like this and napped the flint. I'm getting too old for this. and all the flakes formed a sort of U shape between his or her knees. And you can still see the very spot. And when you piece the pieces together, you find, of course, there's a missing tool in the middle. And it's sitting there on the floor. The whole site is covered back up now. This was the number of axes they found in that one area at Boxgrove on the chalk. So there were real people 500,000 years ago on the Downs. Why? Because there's flint. And flint allows us not only to prevent ourselves being eaten by predators, but also to kill the prey we needed to survive. An essential technology in that age. In fact, those stone tools defined technology for us. 2-3 million years we went with nothing but stone tools. This is one I actually found myself. Remember, I'm a rock person, so I'm never looking up, I'm always looking down. So I'm always finding fivers and car parks and stuff, but this is a Neolithic axe I found. So Ammonites and architecture. Coming back to Brighton for a minute then, this is actually in Lewis. Do you know whose house this is?
Mantell.
Mantell, well done. So Gideon Mantell, who is a huge hero of mine, perhaps the person, who shouted that out? Right up the back there. Gideon Mantell, that's his house. And if you look carefully up the top there, you'll see that Ammonites, there was an architect called Amon Wild, and his first practice run at having Ammonites on the top of these balusters were in Gideon Mantell's house in Lewis. And I love this architectural feature. And if you go to Brighton and start looking up this time, you'll see them everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Okay, so this one is on the old Steen. You've probably never seen it, so I laid off a bit, but beautiful pilaster capitals at the top of that. Further down behind the Queen's Hotel off the seafront, up the top there, again, the same things. You really have to look out for these things. That's down Preston, is it Preston Street, where all the restaurants are in Brighton, that one restaurant street, you know it. And then further on into Hove, my favourite. I think it's a bit too much for me in terms of architecture, this, but look at every one of those pillars. Amazing Ammonite pillars. And this is up at Montpellier Road, perhaps my favourite example on these beautiful mansions in a sort of half circle in that area. And this, if I had one house I could live in Brighton, it would be this one. Okay, and now we have the Ammonite in the seafront. Now, coming back into the Steen for a moment, you've got some of these Ammonites at the top. If you go 2 houses up here, you come to the house in which Gideon Mantell actually lived. And there's a little plaque here that says so. It's badly eroded now, but he was a terribly important figure in geology and in paleontology in particular. In fact, there are 3 figures that are real heroes of mine because they were almost wiped out of history in terms of the lead up to the theory of evolution, 1859, Origin of Species. That's William Smith, Mary Anning, and Gideon Mantell. The first guy, William Smith, was an uneducated guy, but he got involved with the railways and he came up with the first geological map of Britain. So if we go from where we are here, right there, and we go up that direction, all the rocks start to get younger and, older and older and older, until you get up to billions of years old up in Scotland, where I come from. But what he recognised and identified was that the fossils in the strata were very different. You never got the same fossils in the same strata. The younger the rocks, the different the fossils. This is an terribly important premise in the eventual argument for evolution. It suggested that there was basically extinction of one form or another. Mary Anning, if you go into the British Museum now, you can see her discoveries here. Plesiosaurs, there are various creatures she found. She was the first to discover that These little round rough things were actually corporites, in other words, the feces from large creatures that swam in the sea at that time. And of course she collected ammonites. This is the only known photograph we think of her. But an amazing, again, you know, not... really, the truth of the matter is that she discovered these things, she knew exactly what she was discovering, made some groundbreaking observations and discoveries, but was written out of history. Really, a bunch of guys stole her work and presented it as their own. And indeed, yes, indeed. And this was her nemesis. This was Gideon Mantell. We'll turn to him for a moment. This was his nemesis, Richard Owen. And boy, does he look like a baddie. You know, you're worse than this, do you, really? And he was the guy who founded the Natural History Museum. Now, if you go into the Natural History Museum now, it's quite difficult to find a statue of this guy. He's got tucked way up the stairs behind you, over your shoulders as well, because he was a real baddie. He took the work of Mantell and his fossils, refused to pay for them, and passed off lots of stuff as his own. If you go into the British Museum now, you'll see Gideon Mantell's fossils back on display. In particular, you will see these, because not up at Cutfield, not far from here, he made an astounding discovery. It was actually his wife, but he discovered these two teeth. Now, he was a good comparative anatomist, and he recognized that these were very similar to the teeth from an iguana, small reptile. He went round and thought, this is a giant iguana. He went around to the aristocrats of the day who ran the Royal Geological Society and so on, and they laughed at him, they dismissed him. They thought that this was merely a sort of Ice Age animal, a big mammal that they knew about. It turns out it was the tooth from the first discovered dinosaur, an iguanodon. So if you were sitting in this seat 120 million years ago, up and down the coast here, there would be 10-metre-sized gigantic herbivores called iguanodon. They'd be everywhere because they'd be hunting, well, not hunting, they're grazing in packs. And if you go along to Hastings, you can see their footprints everywhere. This is another really interesting walk. If you really want to see loads of iguanodon footprints, go along to that beach there, that bit, you know, that bit just beyond Hastings, where the cliff is. And you can see this big sort of toenail bit. You can even see imprints of the skin. This is Cambridge University work. And of course the footprints lying on the beach. And thankfully, they have now recognised the wonderful Gideon Mantell, whose work, along with the work of Mary Anning and the work of Ian Smith, was pieced together. Then other geologists like Ryle came along. Darwin had Ryle's books on the boat as he went to South America. And Darwin really attributes a lot of his insights to his background knowledge that came from others in geology. And some of that background knowledge came from the three figures I mentioned. But more importantly, I think Gideon Mantell is the big hero for me, because he had that strata view, that dynamic view of fossils through time, through millions of years of time. Because you need deep time to understand evolution. And there is, thankfully, a dinosaur in the British Museum named after him, Mantellosaurus, and indeed a species of ammonite named after him as well, which I have actually found several of in my trips. These are from Glen Quarry. So I want to end there because I think you live in a wonderful place. I think you live in a beautiful place. I'm glad I moved here, but there are some wonderful things to find if you just get out with your dog on your own and do a bit of walking. But they tell you a lot. They not only tell you a lot about the landscape. Everywhere I go, if I travel, I look at a geological map, because the geology shapes the workplace. I grew up in central Scotland. I grew up in a mining village because the rocks are carboniferous. They had coal. It shaped my whole life. All of my relatives worked in the mines. They no longer do. But the same is here. The Industrial Revolution didn't really hit this part of the world, which is why you have all those beautiful little parish churches. It never really hit here because there were no minerals. You were sort of offbeat in a way. And funny sort of way, that saved all that beauty. You know, if you go into these little churches, which I love doing around here, they've not been ruined. Some of them are the original Saxon structures, in fact. So yeah, I think you're really fortunate to live in this part of the world. And hopefully I've given you a few pointers, a few places you might want to go when you leave tomorrow. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.